The letter arrived on a Thursday. Cecily Wren noticed it the way she noticed everything in this house, quietly, from a distance, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that observation was the only currency she could spend without cost. She had been crossing the upper landing with an armful of account ledgers when she saw the footman hand it to Mrs. Farley, and Mrs. Farley's hand closed over it too quickly, and Mrs. Farley turned in the direction of the back stairs rather than the morning room. And that was how Cecily knew the letter was not meant for the Duke of Ashvale at all. It was meant to reach someone before he did. She said nothing. She carried her ledgers to the estate office, set them on the writing table with the precision of someone who had no reason to be noticed, and returned to her work. She was the household steward's assistant, a position so invisible that she had once stood in a doorway for 3 full minutes while Lord Ashvale's mother discussed her as though she were furniture. Miss Wren? The paid woman. The one who keeps the books. She had heard the words rendered in every possible tone, dismissive, pitying, brisk, occasionally almost kind in the way that reminded her the kindness was conditional, and she had learned to receive them all the same way, with a small nod and a quieter step. What she had not been hired to do was think about the letter. She thought about it all the same. The house itself was the kind of house that made thinking about things feel like a transgression. Ashvale Park sat 2 miles from the nearest village in the Shropshire Hills, a grey stone structure of 4 wings and 3 gardens, built in the time of the 2nd Duke, and added to in the time of the 4th, and it had the quality of having absorbed a great deal of human feeling over many decades, without having resolved any of it. The corridors were wide and cool and very quiet in the January mornings, and there were rooms Cecily had never entered, and rooms she entered daily. And the rooms she entered daily had taught her more than she had anticipated about the family she served. The estate office smelled of old paper and candle wax, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that had been important for a long time. The library smelled of leather and cedarwood. The kitchen passage smelled of bread and something else, something older and more difficult to name, which was the particular smell of people who had lived close together for many years and had learned each other's rhythms without ever quite becoming friends. She had been hired in February of the previous year, on the recommendation of Mr. Wreath, the estate solicitor, who had known her father and who had told the household steward, a phlegmatic man named Hobbs, that Miss Wren kept accounts with an accuracy he had rarely encountered in someone of her age and station. Hobbs had been skeptical. He had become, in the months since, something approaching respectful. The estate records, which had been maintained in a state of approximate order by his predecessor, were now in a state of precision that had twice caught errors of several £100 that would otherwise have passed unnoticed. Hobbs said little about this. The Duke had said nothing about it at all, which Cecily had understood correctly to mean that he was aware of it and considered it the expected level of performance, which was itself a kind of respect in his register, even if it did not feel like one in hers. She was the daughter of a minor clergyman from Wiltshire, educated past her station by a father who had believed in education the way some men believed in weather, as an absolute reality without regard for convenience. She could read Latin. She could manage an estate's quarterly accounts to within a shilling. She could tell you the exact provisions of the corn laws and the likely effect of a wet summer on the price of winter wheat, and none of this was any use to her in the world she actually inhabited, which was the world of women who needed a position and could not afford to be particular about the conditions of it. So she kept accounts in other people's houses, and she was grateful, and she was quiet, and she was the paid woman. 3 weeks before the letter arrived, a woman had come to the estate by private carriage. Cecily had not seen her face, but she had seen the carriage livery and the way the footmen straightened and did not quite look at each other. and she had seen the Duke himself cross the forecourt in the January cold without his coat, which was the only time she had ever seen him move with something other than the measured authority that seemed to generate warmth of its own. She had heard the woman described later in the kitchens in the careful euphemistic language of the serving class. "A very fine lady," one housemaid said, folding a tablecloth with great attention. "From his London days," said another. And then the conversation had shifted, and no one had said the word that sat in the space after London days. And Cecily had understood it perfectly. She was the household steward's assistant. It was not her place to form an opinion about the Duke's private life. She had formed one anyway, and it was this. Richard Ashvale, the 5th Duke of Ashvale, was a man who had done something he could not undo, and the weight of it showed in the particular way he held his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. He was not a comfortable man. He was not an uncomfortable one either. He occupied a space in the house that was entirely his own. He was found in the estate office in the mornings, the library after dinner, the back garden in the early evening if the weather permitted, and he moved through the rest of the house with the quality of a decision already made, disturbing nothing he did not mean to disturb. He was 36 years old, which Cecily knew from the estate records, and he had the kind of face that took up more space than his actual features warranted. Heavy brow, direct eyes of a dark gray-green, a jaw set in permanent slight tension, as though he were always in the middle of deciding something. He had given Cecily his direct attention precisely once, in an unrepeatable way, when she had caught an error in the steward's quarterly accounts that would have led to an overpayment of considerable size. He had looked at her correction for a long moment, and then he had said, "Thank you, Miss Wren," and had returned to his work. She had noted the quality of the thanks, and filed it away precisely. She had, in those 11 months, developed a thorough and involuntary education in the Duke of Ashvale. She knew that he took his coffee without sugar, and his correspondence before breakfast, and that he answered letters in order of date received rather than order of sender's importance, which she considered a quietly radical act in a man of his position. She knew that he walked the East Garden on mornings when he was troubled about something, and that on those mornings he walked it twice rather than once. She knew that he had a habit of setting his pen down at precisely the same angle each time he lifted it from a page, which she suspected he was unaware of. She knew that he had a smaller estate in Worcestershire that he had not visited in 3 years, and that there was a room in the west wing that was locked, and that Mrs. Farley had the only key, and that no one discussed either of these things in his hearing. She had not intended to know any of this. She had intended to keep the accounts precisely and accept her wages and live in the small room on the 3rd floor that looked out over the kitchen garden and not develop any inconvenient opinions about anyone in the household. She had nonetheless developed 11 months' worth of them, and they were organized with the same precision as everything else she kept. And they were, she had concluded, going to cause her a great deal of difficulty. If you have ever stood close to a secret you were not supposed to know, pause here with her, because what comes next will ask something of you. The morning the letter reappeared, which is to say the morning Cecily learned that Mrs. Farley had not delivered it, had in fact held it for 9 days in the locked drawer of the housekeeper's sitting room, was also the morning she was asked to help Mrs. Farley with the household correspondence. The housekeeper was ill, just a cold, nothing serious. But her hands shook and her eyes were red, and when she opened the drawer for the household stationery, she reached past the stationery, and her hand hesitated, and then she pressed her lips together and said, "Miss Wren, I need you to do something for me. I need you to not ask me why." Mrs. Farley was 63 years old. She had served the Ashvale household since she was 19. She was not a woman who asked for things without cause. Cecily took the letter. She had to take it in stages. First, she closed her fingers around it. Then she looked at Mrs. Farley Fye's face. Then she said, "I will handle it." And Mrs. Farley let out a breath that sounded as though she had been holding it for 9 days, which was perhaps exactly how long she had been holding it, and she pressed Cecily's hand once, briefly, and went back to her bed. She stood in the corridor outside the housekeeper's sitting room, with it held in both hands, and she understood exactly what it was. The handwriting on the front was a woman's, elegant but rushed. The ink pressed in some places and lifting in others, as though the writer had stopped several times to reconsider what she was saying. The seal was broken. Mrs. Farley had read it, and Mrs. Farley's hands had shaken, and now Cecily was holding it in a corridor she was not supposed to be in, outside a room she had no business entering, carrying something that was either the salvation or the destruction of this household. And she had not yet decided what she was going to do. She did not read it. That was the first thing she chose. She did not read it. Because the letter was not hers to read, and because she already knew, in the particular quiet way she knew most things, that reading it would not change what she was going to do. She had been hired to serve this household honestly. She served honestly. She went to find the Duke. This, the household would later agree, was either the bravest or the most foolish thing Miss Wren had ever done. She found him in the estate office, which was her office also in the mornings, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up, which took longer than it might have because Richard Ashvale was not a man who looked up from his work without reason. He looked up and he looked at her, and he said nothing, which was how he always greeted an interruption, with the silence that said he was still present and was allowing the interruption to proceed. "Your Grace," she said, "I have something that belongs to you." She held out the letter. He did not take it immediately. He looked at it, and then at her face, and then back at it. And when he finally reached for it, his fingers did not quite touch hers, which meant she noticed the moment when they did not, which meant she noticed that she had expected them to, which told her something about herself that she quickly filed in the same drawer she kept most things about herself. His hand was warm. She was close enough to know that much, and she wished, briefly and sincerely, that she had not been. He read it. She watched his face. His face did not change dramatically. There was a slight flicker at the corner of his left eye, a particular stillness that descended over him like weather coming in from the west. And then his jaw tightened once, and then he was still. He set the letter on the writing table with the careful deliberateness of a man putting something down that he did not want to throw. "Where did you get this?" he said. It was not a question. The words were level and very quiet, the way a man's voice was when he was controlling something, and the control was costing him. "Mrs. Farley," Cecily said. "She has been holding it for 9 days. She asked me to help her this morning with the correspondence. I believe she found she could not continue to hold it, and I was the person she trusted with the decision." He said nothing. "I did not read it," she said. He looked at her then in a way he had not looked at her in the 11 months she had worked in this house. He looked at her directly and with a kind of attention that was different from the attention with which one looked at furniture, at ledgers, at the household accounts. He said, "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you might wonder," she said, "and I would rather you know." Something moved across his face. Not softness exactly, but the shadow of a door, briefly considered. Then it was gone, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Wren. You may return to your work." And she did. The letter was from the woman who had come in January. Her name, Cecily did not know. What she had brought with her, Cecily did not know. What she intended, Cecily understood, was a great deal of damage. Delivered very carefully. In the weeks that followed, the household shifted in the way that households shifted when their master was carrying something heavy and not speaking about it. The footmen were quieter. The morning rooms were kept in stricter order than usual. Hobbs completed his rounds earlier and left the estate office to Cecily for longer stretches, which was either consideration or avoidance, and had the practical effect of leaving her alone with the accounts and her own thoughts for 2 hours each afternoon. It was during one of those 2-hour stretches, late in February, that she sat at the writing table and allowed herself to think about October, which was the month everything had become complicated in a way she had not planned for. She had been returning from the stillroom on a Tuesday afternoon, early in October, when she had passed the open kitchen door and stopped. The Duke was seated in one of the plain wooden chairs at the kitchen hearth, in his shirt sleeves, with a book of illustrated stories open across his knees. The estate carpenter's youngest daughter was laid out on a pallet beside him, flushed with fever, her eyes half closed, her breathing audible from the doorway. The roads had been bad for 3 days, and her family could not be reached, and the child could not be left alone, and he had apparently decided, without telling anyone, that he would be the person who stayed. He read steadily and without flourish, his voice at the particular, low, unhurried register one used for a frightened child at dusk. And the child lay with the whole-body stillness of someone who had found something to hold on to. He had not told anyone he was there. There was no household witness, no servant who would report the Duke's charity at the next opportunity, no audience at all except Cecily in the doorway, and she had turned away before he could see her, and she had stood in the corridor with her hand pressed flat against the wall for a long time, breathing in the cold air. That was how she had known. The precise quality of a man who did a costly thing and did not require it to be seen. It was not her place to be in love with the Duke of Ashvale. She had been in love with him since October nonetheless, and she had managed it with the same discipline she brought to the accounts, keeping it organized and not permitting it to overflow into the columns where it did not belong. On a Wednesday evening in February, the Duke came to the estate office after supper, closed the door, and told her about Mr. Vance. He told her everything. The friendship, which had been genuine, the man's illness, which had progressed quickly, the promise made in a sick room in December 3 years prior, the quarterly payments made since, the letter of instruction he had written and given to Mr. Reith, and which a woman in Brussels had now decided to reframe. He told her without embellishment and without self-justification. He stated the facts in the order they had occurred, his voice measured and steady, only the quality of his right hand flat on the table edge suggesting any interior pressure at all. "He was my friend," he said after a pause. "I do not say that as an explanation. It was simply true. He was one of a very small number of people in my life about whom that has been true, and when he was dying, he was afraid for his wife, and the least I could do was be present for the fear and try to resolve it." She said nothing, because she understood he was not asking her to respond. He was saying it because it was the center of the thing, and he had not said it aloud to anyone. "Mrs. Vance is threatening you," she said, when the silence had settled. "She is implying a threat," he said. "She has not named a price. She is noting, with the precise care of a woman who understands how drawing-room conversations work, that a letter of the type she holds could be read in a certain way, in the right drawing rooms, and that the reading might interfere with arrangements that are currently under discussion. There is no formal arrangement," he said before she could speak. "There are expectations, which my mother has been cultivating for several months. Lady Fellows is a perfectly agreeable young woman, and she has done nothing to deserve the position she has been placed in by those expectations. A brief pause. Neither, for the record, have I confirmed them. Something in the way he said it told her a great deal. She filed it away carefully and said, "I believe the letter Mrs. Vance is referring to may not be the only document in the matter. When I organized the estate correspondence in November, I noted a sealed folder in the left cabinet marked with a man's name and dated December 3 years prior. I assumed it was legal paperwork and did not open it. It is still there." He went very still. "I did not open it," she said, "because it was not mine to open. I am telling you it exists because it is yours, and because I believe a solicitor might find it useful." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Wren," in a voice that was different from any voice he had used in her direction in 11 months, lower and more careful, the way a man spoke when he was choosing to use a word that cost him something. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. "Are you doing this?" She said, "Because you sat in a kitchen chair in the wet and read fairy tales to a child who needed someone, and you did not tell anyone about it. And I think a man who does that deserves to have his honest promise defended." The room was very quiet. The fire shifted in the grate. She could hear her own heartbeat, which had become inconveniently audible, and the wind at the window glass, and the particular deep quiet of a house at night that had been quiet for a very long time. She was aware of the exact distance between where he stood and where she sat. The width of the writing table, which was not, she thought, a sufficient width. "You saw that," he said finally. "I heard you," she said. "I left before you could see me." "I know," he said. "I heard you leave." He looked at her with the full unguarded attention she had seen him give to almost nothing else in 11 months. "I have thought about that frequently since October." She said nothing. She held very still. "Thank you," he said at last, "for the folder, and for the other thing." He left. She sat in the estate office for a considerable time after that, with her hands in her lap and the fire burning down and the accounts untouched, and thought about the way he had said he had thought about it frequently since October, which meant since the exact moment she had understood her own situation, which meant they had been thinking about the same October for the same number of months, and she did not know what to do with that except to keep it very carefully, like something made of glass. She thought also about what he had told her of Mr. Vance, which had been more than she had been prepared for. Not the practical facts of the arrangement, those she had reconstructed already from the folder's existence, but the small, precise details he had allowed himself to include. The way the man had refused to be told his diagnosis was serious for the first 3 months, because he had things he wished to finish and did not want to lose the time to being properly frightened. The way he had dictated the terms of the arrangement himself, carefully, as though he were directing a legal document rather than facing the end of his life. The way the Duke had visited him each week in those final months, often sitting for hours with very little to say, because the man had told him plainly that he preferred company to conversation, and he had simply provided it. She thought about what it meant to know those things about a person, and to have no one to tell them to. She thought about the particular way the Duke's voice had gone careful, when he said he had been one of a very small number of people in my life, about whom that has been true, and the way he had not looked away from her when he said it, and the way she had understood, with a precision that surprised her, that she was being told something about a wound she had already partially identified, and that the telling itself was an act of considerable trust. She blew out the candle at 10:30, which was later than she usually stayed in the office, and walked to her room through the dark, quiet corridors of Ashvale Park, and thought, with the particular clarity that came to her in the dark, that she had managed 11 months of her own feelings with some discipline, but that discipline had its limits, and that she had perhaps arrived at one of those limits, and that she intended to continue doing her work honestly regardless, because that was the only thing she knew how to do. The solicitor came on a Monday. The Duchess Dowager arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days earlier than her scheduled visit, with no advance notice. Lady Ashvale, the Duke's mother, a woman of 70 who wore her hair in the style of 20 years past and carried her disapproval as other women carried their reticules, as a necessary accessory without which she did not leave the house, swept into the entrance hall and looked at Cecily crossing it with a stack of correspondence, and said to the Duke, quite audibly, "Still the same paid woman, I see. I had rather hoped Hobbs had found someone more suitable by now." The Duke said nothing. He said nothing, which was what he always did. And the silence was not the same as a correction, and Cecily knew it, and received it in the customary way, with a small nod and a quieter step, and continued across the entrance hall, and did not allow her face to change. Mr. Reith examined the folder on Monday afternoon. He was in the estate office for 2 hours, and when he emerged he spoke to the Duke in the library for 40 minutes, and then he found Cecily in the corridor outside and said, in his dry and procedural voice, "This disposes of the matter entirely. Mrs. Vance will receive appropriate correspondence today." He said it with a finality that felt, in the quiet of the house, like something settling into place. Then he found his hat and left. Lady Ashvale heard of the development by evening. She arrived in the estate office the following afternoon at 4 o'clock, which was her hour for correcting the management of things she had not been asked to manage, and looked at the writing table and at Cecily behind it, and said, with the flat confidence of 70 years of unchallenged social authority, "The paid woman found it. How very fortunate for all of us." Cecily said nothing. "I trust," Lady Ashvale said, turning to examine the cabinet against the far wall as though assessing its arrangement, "that this does not alter your understanding of your position here, Miss Wren. You were hired to keep records. You found one. The household owes you a month's salary and nothing more." "Yes, my lady," Cecily said. "You will not," said the Dowager, settling her fan against her wrist with the particular preciseness of a woman who had weaponized her accessories for decades. "Have ideas." The word ideas in the Dowager's mouth had a specific and precise meaning, and they both understood it exactly. Cecily looked at Lady Ashvale's profile and received the word in the customary way. "No, my lady," she said, which was not a lie. She did not have ideas. She had a single specific and fully formed feeling she had been managing for 4 months, which was a different and more exact thing than ideas. Lady Ashvale left. Cecily sat in the silence she left behind, which was the silence of a woman being reminded of her exact dimensions in a world that had decided those dimensions in advance. She had known this silence since she was 17. Since the first morning she had understood what it meant to have education and perception and judgment in a body the world had sorted into the back row. The knowing did not make it feel smaller. It simply made it feel familiar, which was its own particular heaviness. She thought about the word ideas, and what the Dowager meant by it, and what she herself meant by what she had said in response. She did not have ideas. She had a single specific and fully formed feeling that had been present in her chest since October, and that she had managed with some discipline, and the discipline was currently under considerable strain. She was honest about this. She was honest about everything. In the end, even the things she would have preferred not to be honest about. Because honesty was the one quality she had that cost nothing to maintain, and gained nothing by its loss. It was the thing she had when she had nothing else. She had kept it in 11 months in this house in which she was the paid woman and nothing more, and she intended to continue to keep it, and what happened next was not hers to decide. She was still sitting with it when the Duke came in. He came in quietly, as he always did, and he looked at the empty doorway the Dowager had vacated, and then at Cecily, and he said, "She said something. She reminded me of my position," Cecily said. "Yes," he said. "She does." He came to stand at the writing table, and then he remained there, which was unusual. He generally moved through rooms with purpose. He had, apparently, stopped having anywhere else to be. "I owe you an apology," he said. "In 11 months I have not once corrected her in your presence. I told myself it was because correction would require conversations I was not ready to have. That was true. It was also cowardice, and I recognized it as such at the time, and I allowed it anyway." The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the February evening had closed in entirely, and the windows held nothing but darkness and the pale reflection of the room, and the two of them, reflected, at some distance from each other. "Why?" Cecily said very carefully. "Were you not ready to have those conversations?" He was quiet for a moment. The tension she had catalogued over so many months was present in his face, but closer to the surface than she had ever seen it, less defended, the way a man looked when he had stopped managing something and was simply standing in its presence. "Because," he said, "a man in my position who intends to do a thing correctly ought not to begin it by doing something else. And I have spent the better part of the past year in the reliable company of a woman whose judgment I trust more than most people's, whose honesty has been consistent past the point of comfort, and whose presence in a room has become a specific kind of information I did not know how to account for." A pause. "That is a great deal to put in a written record, which is why I am saying it aloud." She set down her pen. He crossed the room to stand beside the writing table, not behind it, which put him at her shoulder, and she rose, because she could not have this particular conversation seated. They stood together in the firelight with the house quiet around them, and he said her first name, not Miss Wren, but Cecily, in his voice, which was lower than she had expected, and which arrived in her chest rather than her ears. "Will you have me?" he said. She looked at him directly, as she had not permitted herself to do in 11 months. She looked at his face, at the tension in the line of his jaw, at the gray at his temples that was not in the estate portrait, at the gray-green of his eyes, which were watching her with the particular quality of absolute stillness she knew now was not coldness. It had never been coldness. It was the stillness of a man who paid full attention to everything he did not permit himself to move toward. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. She had not known, until that moment, that he had been holding one. His hand came to rest against her hand, which was at her side, warm and careful and present. And that was all. And it was not a small thing. And she did not treat it as one. She permitted herself, for the first time in 4 months, to know exactly what she felt, without the drawer and without the management. And it was considerable. And it was hers. And she intended to keep it. What followed was both simple and complicated in the ways that mattered. The days between the estate office and the formal announcement had a particular quality she had not anticipated, which was the quality of a house learning something new about itself. The footman noticed. The cook noticed. Mrs. Farley said nothing to anyone, but the expression on her face in the mornings had the same quality as a woman who had been holding a tension for several months and had just been told she could release it. Hobbs received the news from the Duke directly, at the writing table in the estate office, while Cecily continued her accounts at the other end of the same table, and Hobbs said, "Very good, Your Grace," in exactly the same tone in which he said everything else. and Cecily appreciated him for it. The Duke himself was not changed. He was precisely himself, which was what she had expected. He came to the estate office in the mornings, and he took his correspondence before breakfast, and he set his pen down at the same angle each time he lifted it from the page. The only difference was that he no longer managed the distance between them with the careful deliberateness she had been cataloging since October. He simply stood where he wished to stand, and when that was near her, it was near her. And when he passed her in the corridor, he looked at her directly in a way that communicated nothing to anyone who was not attending closely, and communicated a great deal to her. She found she was very fond of this arrangement. Mrs. Vance received her solicitor's letter in Brussels and withdrew without further correspondence. Lady Fellows's father received the Duke's visit with visible relief, which told Cecily something she had not expected, and which made her regard Lady Fellows with warmth. Lady Ashvale the Dowager heard the news in person, said what she was required to say, and then was quiet, and then said, in the flat tone of a woman making a significant concession without being observed to make it, "The girl finds things. I will say that for her." It was, from Lady Ashvale, something close to a blessing. They were married in the chapel on the estate, in the second week of April, on a morning when the light came in low and warm through the old stone windows, and the grounds outside were the first tentative green of early spring. Mrs. Farley stood at the back and cried without apology, because she had been holding the situation in her chest since October, and could now release it entirely. The estate carpenter's daughter, recovered now, and Rosie, sat in the second pew, and watched the proceedings with the whole concentrated attention of a child who understood she was seeing something important. It was not a grand ceremony. There was no London party, no gathering of county families assembled to witness the confirmation of the hierarchy's approval. The vicar who conducted the service had known the Duke since his boyhood and read the words of the marriage rite with the quiet gravity of a man who took words seriously and was glad, on this particular morning, to be using the right ones. Lady Ashvale the Dowager was present in the first pew, in grey silk, and she sat with the upright correctness of a woman who had decided, privately and permanently, to regard the proceedings as orderly rather than satisfactory, which was the most that could be reasonably asked of her, and was what she delivered. Cecily was grateful for it. She was grateful, in those few minutes, for a great many things she had not expected to be grateful for, and she kept the list brief because there was a ceremony in progress, and she did not wish to be distracted from it. It was the kind of ceremony that belonged to two people who had been paying careful attention to each other for a long time in rooms they were not supposed to share, and it had the quality of things that had been earned rather than given. Nothing wasted, nothing performed for an audience, everything precisely meant. That evening, in the estate office, the Duke set a small object on the writing table, a miniature in a worn silver frame, a portrait of a man in his middle 40s, round-faced and dark-eyed, and wearing the expression of someone who had been made to sit still longer than he found comfortable. She picked it up. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Henry," he said. He would have thought all of this was greatly amusing. He had a gift for finding the humor in situations I considered serious. He paused. He would have liked you. He had a particular respect for people who told the truth when the easier thing was not to, and who kept their word when no one was watching to confirm they had. She held the miniature for a moment, looking at the round face and the dark eyes and the slight impatience of the mouth, and thought about a man she had never met, who had been frightened for his wife, and had trusted the right person with that fear. She thought about the specific quality of trust involved in a dying man choosing carefully who to rely upon, and the specific quality of the person who had been chosen, and the long chain of small honest acts that had produced this particular evening in this particular room. Then she crossed to the mantelpiece and set the miniature there, in the warm firelight, where it would be visible from the writing table, where she would see it every morning when she opened the accounts. It seemed to her the correct place for it, not locked in a drawer or carried privately, but present in the room where the work of the estate was done, where the records were kept, where a woman who believed in honest accounting could look at a man's face and remember what it looked like when someone kept their word. Outside, the April evening settled into its own particular quiet, the kind that came after long effort and did not ask for anything more. She was the Duchess of Ashvale, which was the most improbable sentence she had ever applied to herself. And she was also still Cecily Wren, who had spent a year in a house that had taken considerable trouble to tell her what she was not, and who had done her work honestly all the same, and who had turned out, in the end, to be precisely the kind of person a man kept a miniature of his best friend to remind himself to find. The fire was warm. The miniature caught the light. The candle on the writing table burned low and was not replaced, because neither of them needed it anymore. And the house around them was quiet. And theirs. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's year in this house moved you, she kept every record honestly, leave a note in the comments, and let her know this one counted too.